In May of 1969, three astronauts flew around the far side of the moon, completely cut off from Earth, and heard something coming through their headsets that none of them could explain. They called it music. And for the next 20 minutes, they seriously debated whether to tell anyone about it at all. This is the story of the Apollo 10 space music, and it's a little different from most of the cases on this channel, because this one isn't actually unsolved. But the way it got turned into a decades-long mystery, and the very human reason three of America's most experienced test pilots almost stayed quiet about it, tells you something important about how stories like this get made. Here's the setup. Apollo 10 was the dress rehearsal for the moon landing, launched in May 1969, 2 months before Apollo 11. On board were Commander Tom Stafford, Command Module Pilot John Young, and Lunar Module Pilot Gene Cernan. Their job was to fly almost everything Apollo 11 would do without actually landing. At one point, Stafford and Cernan undocked the lunar module, nicknamed Snoopy, and flew it separately from Young's command module Charlie Brown, practicing the rendezvous they'd need for a real landing mission. And they did this on the far side of the moon, the one place in the entire mission where they were completely alone. No radio contact with Houston, no contact with Young and the other spacecraft except on their own short-range link. Just two men in a tiny spacecraft, further from another human being than anyone had ever been before. And that's when they heard it. Here's the actual exchange, pulled directly from NASA's own mission transcript. Cernan keys his mic. That music even sounds outer spacey, doesn't it? You hear that? That whistling sound? Stafford confirms. Yes. Cernan draws it out. Woo, ooh. Over in the command module, Young checks in. Did you hear that whistling sound too? And Cernan answers, yeah. Sounds like, outer space type music. Young's response is the one that gets quoted the most. I wonder what it is. They keep flying the mission. They photograph craters. They run through checklists. But the sound keeps coming back, off and on, for almost an hour. And about 6 minutes after first mentioning it, Cernan says something that tells you exactly how strange this felt in the moment. Boy, that sure is weird music. And then John Young says the line that would define this story for the next 50 years, we're going to have to find out about that. Nobody will believe us. Think about who's saying that. These aren't nervous rookies. Stafford, Young, and Cernan were among the most experienced pilots in the entire space program. Young would later walk on the moon himself and command a space shuttle. These were men whose entire careers depended on being seen as unshakable. And here they are, alone on the far side of the moon, seriously discussing whether their own crewmates back on Earth would think they'd lost it. This wasn't paranoia. In the test pilot culture of the 1960s, there was an unspoken rule. You didn't admit to anything that sounded like a psychological crack because it could end your career. Just one mission earlier, on Apollo 9, astronaut Rusty Schweickart reported feeling nauseous in space, and it became a serious mark against him. So when three men hear unexplained music behind the moon, their first instinct isn't panic. It's calculation. Will anyone believe this? And will admitting it cost us our next flight? Here's the detail. Almost nobody mentions when they tell this story. In that same conversation, John Young offers his own theory, live in real time, without any prompting. He says, probably due to the VHF ranging, I guess? VHF, very high-frequency radio. The same radio system the lunar module and command module were using to communicate with each other and measure the distance between them. Young, an engineer and test pilot, essentially guesses the correct answer within minutes of hearing the sound for the first time. This detail matters a lot for what happens next, because for almost 50 years, that's basically where the story sat. A strange transcript filed away, unremarkable. Until 2016, when a Science Channel series called NASA's Unexplained Files aired an episode about it, and the framing was very different from what actually happened. The show implied the recordings had been secretly classified for decades and were only now coming to light. It leaned hard into the idea that something inexplicable happened, while the astronauts were conveniently cut off from any way to verify it. The trailer had the tone of a found-footage horror movie, complete with static, ominous music, and a narrator calling the sound extremely unsettling. NASA's own history office pushed back almost immediately. They posted publicly that the transcript had been available at the National Archives since 1973, and the audio itself had been online since 2012. Nothing about this was secret. Nothing about this was new. Gene Cernan himself was asked about the resurfaced story and essentially shrugged, saying he didn't remember the incident exciting him enough to take it seriously at the time. So what actually caused it? The leading explanation, and the one most consistent with the evidence, comes down to exactly what Young guessed in the moment. The lunar module and the command module were running separate VHF radio systems at the same time in very close proximity to each other for the first time in any Apollo mission. Apollo 8, the previous flight to the moon, only had one spacecraft, the command module, so there was no second VHF system nearby to interfere with. Apollo 10 was the first mission to fly the lunar module all the way to the moon and operate two separate radio systems near each other in orbit. Radio engineers who've studied Apollo's systems point out that this kind of hardware, carrying multiple frequencies for voice, telemetry, and ranging data, was known to produce exactly this kind of interference. A rising and falling tone that could easily be mistaken for something otherworldly if you didn't know what to listen for. There was another theory floated in that same TV special, that the sound might have been caused by charged particles interacting with the spacecraft, similar to something NASA later observed with the Cassini probe near Saturn. It's a creative idea. It's also almost certainly wrong, because the moon has no meaningful atmosphere and no magnetic field, the two things you'd need to generate and channel that kind of particle interference in the first place. Whatever caused the sound, it had to come from inside the system, not from outside it. And here's the detail that closes the case about as tightly as these things ever get closed. Months later, on Apollo 11, Michael Collins orbited alone in the command module, while Armstrong and Aldrin walked on the surface. Mission planners warned him in advance that he might hear a strange whistling sound, and told him it was almost certainly VHF interference. Collins later wrote in his book, "There is a strange noise in my headset now, an eerie woo-woo sound. Had I not been warned about it, it would have scared the hell out of me." Because he was warned, he wasn't scared, he just noted it and kept working. Same sound, same explanation. Completely different reaction, because this time someone had already done the work of explaining it. So this isn't a case where the truth is uncertain. It's a case where a completely mundane, well-understood piece of radio engineering got repackaged decades later as a government cover-up. Because astronauts heard eerie, unexplained sounds on the dark side of the moon is a much better television hook than two radio systems produced interference at overlapping frequencies. That doesn't make the original moment any less real, or any less human. Three men really did hear something they couldn't immediately explain, genuinely wondered if anyone would believe them, and had the presence of mind to keep working anyway. That's not a mystery. That's just what it looks like to be a professional, a very long way from home, encountering something new for the first time. If you want cases like this, the real ones, whether they're still open questions or quietly resolved ones that got mythologized along the way, that's what this channel does every week. We covered the wow signal, a radial pulse from 1977 that's never repeated and never been explained. We covered Tabby's star, a star whose dimming briefly had scientists considering an artificial explanation. Subscribe if you want the next one when it lands. And before you go, knowing what you know now, if you'd been floating alone behind the moon in 1969, hearing that sound for the first time, with zero contact with Earth, would you have said anything to Houston? Or would you have kept it to yourself, the way they almost did? Let me know in the comments.